Hi everyone, good afternoon again. My name is Rouwette from Energetics, and welcome to this webinar where we'll be explaining the new Streamlined carbon neutral certification process for Australasian Environmental Product Declarations, or EPDs. We've got three speakers for you today. We've got Dan Raftopoulos from the Department of the Environment and Energy and the National Carbon Offset Standard and Carbon Neutral team. After Dan, we've got Steve Mitchell, who is the chair of the Australasian EPD program. He'll be explaining more about what EPDs are and the Australasian EPD program, what it does. And finally, I'll be talking about the alignment between the ALCAS and Australasian EPD program. And I'll give you some details of how the alignment works and what to do if you want to make use of this streamlined process. First off, I'll switch over to Dan, who's going to introduce the National Carbon Offset Standard and the carbon neutral procedures.
Thanks, Rob. And before I begin, I just want to say thank you to Rob and Steve for inviting me to talk today. It's exciting to discuss this piece of work that both the ALCAS and Australasian Environmental Declaration Program have been working on for many months now. Before I begin, just a brief overview about myself. I'm a member of the team from the Department of Environment and Energy that is responsible for managing the National Carbon Offset Standard and administering the Carbon Neutral Program, which I'll discuss later on. Myself, I'm primarily responsible for overseeing the National Carbon Offset Standard for products and services. The National Carbon Offset Standard is a best practice voluntary framework for measuring and reducing carbon emissions. The standard itself is maintained by the Australian government. As you'll see on the screen here, the standard actually covers 5 different fields. This includes organizations, products and services, events, and recently we added buildings and precincts as of last year. The primary purpose of the standard is to achieve carbon neutrality, and during today's presentation we'll be specifically referring to the product and services standard when we refer to the ALCAS. Okay. Now I'll be talking about the carbon neutral framework, and as you can see, there are 4 key steps to achieve neutrality. I should mention that all 4 steps are the same across all 5 standards of the ALCAS. Now, the first step is measuring. What this means is measuring your emissions that are produced while creating a product or delivering a service. Under the product and services standard, the carbon account is typically calculated through a lifecycle analysis or an LCA, and is the ability to use an LCA that forms the basis of the certification, the streamlined certification pathway that we'll be discussing today. And I think it's also important to note that when we talk about calculating emissions, we are referring to calculating all scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Now, the second step after calculating your emissions from producing your product is identifying reductions, and that is to maximize your value in achieving a carbon neutrality. It is important to actively investigate the opportunities to reduce your emissions where possible. The standard itself is not prescriptive in terms of the emissions and the type of reductions that can be achieved. This means that any reduction activity, no matter how big or small, can be undertaken. The third step after reducing your emissions is to purchase carbon offset units. This allows you to reduce your impact on the environment to 0. And I will be talking a little further about offsets later on. And the final step of the framework is to report. This is to transparently document the data and publicly report on your claim of carbon neutrality. I should also note that this process typically involves the step of an independent audit. The process of publicly reporting is an important aspect as it allows all stakeholders to independently assess the data of the carbon neutrality claim, which builds trust, transparency, and ultimately the credibility in the carbon neutral claim. So, as I had just mentioned, the use of offsets under the standard is the main mechanism to achieve carbon neutrality. So I'll just spend a few moments talking about our offsets work. The use of offsets allows a business to achieve carbon neutrality by compensating for the emissions that are produced that cannot be avoided or reduced. In practical terms, to achieve neutrality, the organisation must purchase the equivalent amount of offsets to the carbon account once it's calculated. This means that, in essence, if a product has produced 100 tonnes of carbon dioxide in its production process, then 100 offsets must be purchased in order to achieve neutrality. In essence, one carbon offset represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide abated. While talking about offsets, I think it's important to talk about the offsets integrity criteria, which is set up under the standard, as you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen here. There are several integrity criteria, principles that apply to the ALCAS. And this is the result of a lot of work that has been conducted by the department to determine what type of offsets are genuine and credible and represents real abatement. For eligible offsets units to be eligible under the standard, the offsets must meet the integrity criteria principles, which you'll see in the green box. Of the criteria, I particularly want to draw your attention to the word additionality and what this means because it's important. Additionality means that emissions reductions that the offset credit is attached to would not have been produced without the financial investment made in that offset project. This means that all the buyers of offsets units around the world are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale, which only leads to beneficial outcomes. Now, just to draw your attention to the box on the bottom of the screen, as you'll see, there are 5 different offset standards which the ALCAS will accept units from. Now, what those 5 standards means is that offset units can be purchased on a global scale, not only from Australia, but from throughout the world. Offset projects can vary in nature and are not only associated with renewable energy. For instance, offset projects can come from energy efficiency projects, fuel switching, vegetation projects such as afforestation, and improved fire management practices, just to name a few. And I should say, offset projects not only reduce emissions, but also bring additional benefits to the environment and the communities that they operate in, such as restoring the ecosystems and creating jobs. And just to wrap up on offsets, I should say today, the standard has enabled the purchase of approximately 2.3 million tonnes of carbon offset units. What this equates to in practical terms is roughly 700,000 cars off the road for a year, or the entire population of cars in Sydney or Melbourne. Okay. So as I mentioned at the start of my talk, the department also manages the carbon neutral program, which is the certification of the National Carbon Offset Standard. Certification against the standard allows participants to use the trademark, which you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen. This allows them to actively market their carbon neutrality. And it is only those participants who have been certified by the department that is able to use that trademark to validate their claim of carbon neutrality. And I should also note that as we now have a carbon neutrality standard for buildings for those interested in certification, the certification is actually built upon a NABERS or Green Star rating and is administered by the Green Buildings Council Australia or the Office of Environment and Heritage through the NABERS program. The department itself manages the 4 other standards of the NCOST. This slide showcases the vast majority of participants that we have certified under the carbon neutral program. As you'll see, these logos represent a diverse group from local councils, large corporations, through to non-profits and SMEs. Through the carbon neutral program, it is now possible to fly carbon neutral, buy carbon neutral food and wine, and source carbon neutral business products. Just to outline, growth in the program has increased by 45% in the past year, which has certainly kept us busy at the department. And to close my talk in reference to the National Carbon Offset Standard, I just want to touch on some of the benefits of carbon neutral certification. And I should note that the underlying reason that it makes business sense is that at first, knowing your emissions leads to financial savings. Organizations have found that when they account for carbon emissions, they look more in depth in terms of the emission sources. And this is especially apparent at the start of the certification phase. And this leads organizations to reducing emissions. And the reductions in emissions that are achieved through energy savings goes hand in hand with the dollar savings realized by purchasing less offsets to become carbon neutral. That is that when committing to achieve carbon neutrality, offsets are used to compensate for the remaining emissions that cannot be reduced. And the third key benefit of achieving certification is that it provides a competitive advantage within the marketplace, while also providing entry into the carbon neutral supply chains. Similarly to having an EPD certification, certified products can now receive credits in infrastructure or rating tools such as GBCA's Green Star program. Again, as I said, certification also allows participants to actively promote their carbon neutrality through the trademark, which is a recognized trademark. The fourth business case to achieve carbon neutrality is that more and more organizations are getting certified for corporate social responsibility reasons. By carefully considering the type of offset projects that participants buy, businesses can align offsets with their organizational values. as I touched on, offset projects can vary in nature, and this diversity allows organizations to invest with those projects that matches their values. This can lead to a tangible story for employees and customers, and allows organizations to market the financial investments that they have made in these projects. And the fifth and final business case I will touch on in terms of benefits is that certification not only provides you with a competitive advantage, it provides credibility. Becoming certified and using the trademark symbolizes the rigor that an organization has gone through to achieve certification. It provides proof that the process of going carbon neutral has been undertaken in a robust way and has been verified by an independent third party, in our case, the department. That wraps up my talk in terms of the National Carbon Offset Standard. And I will hand it back over to Rob. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. As I'll pass it on to Steve Mitchell, just a quick mention that you can ask questions at the end of the talk. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions later on. So please type them in the comment box if you do have any questions, or raise your hand at the end, and we'll attend to it. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you, Dan. And just to reiterate Dan's introduction, we're very pleased to be involved in this collaboration with the department and see the benefits of carbon neutral certification flow through to the Australian community. So, and thanks very much, Rob, for your work on this and pushing this through. Okay, so I'm Stephen Mitchell, the chair of the Australasian EPD program, which covers Australia and New Zealand. I'll hop straight into my presentation. First of all, I'd just like to explain what an EPD is. It's really provides comprehensive science-based environmental data. So it's a statement of that data. They're verified documents that are publicly available and freely available, and they're based on life cycle assessment, as are the carbon neutral products and services. And it covers the information across all or part of the life cycle. It's based on international and best practice European standards. The process follows carefully product category rules, or PCRs. I'll explain a bit more about those a bit later.
Steve, sorry.
Yes, Rob?
Sorry to interrupt you, Deb. I think your screen is not up yet.
Okay, I'll just press that button. Is that okay now?
It's coming up now. Yep, that's all working. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so just left off with product category rules. I'll explain a bit more about those in a moment. EPDs can also have other environmental information. They're not just a bunch of data, but companies can provide other relevant environmental information about their products or services. Typically, they're valid for about 5 years for construction products and 3 years for other products. So here's an example of the content of an EPD. It shows the scope of the declaration, the results of the life cycle assessment. EPD is really a summary of that life cycle assessment that's done. Details on the methodology, the results, and the verification information. These are all publicly available, as I said, on the Australasian EPD website. So they can be very fancy, very nice graphically as well, or can be very simple documents. It's up to the company themselves how they want to present the information. Now, the environmental impacts that are presented in an EPD are very comprehensive. They cover the carbon footprint in terms of global warming potential, and that's our linkage here with the ALCAS program. But they also cover other aspects of environmental impacts, ozone depletion, photochemical smog, eutrophication or algal blooms, acidification potential, and non-renewable resource consumption, fossil fuel consumption. So they're very comprehensive and expansive reporting on all those environmental impacts. How they're used? Well, there's a number of ways they're used. They're really business-to-business communication tools. They can be used also for business-to-consumer communication. But they're really, the life cycle assessments themselves, as Dan pointed out before, they help a business make better environmental decisions, and they also help businesses make more sustainable design and purchasing decisions. Here's an example here of our construction product EPDs, which comply with European standard 15804. That allows them to be used in another European standard, EN 15978, to make a comprehensive environmental performance of the building. Okay, so all the EPDs going into a building, they can contribute data to the overall, improve the design and environmental footprint of building and fit outs. So that's their construction products, one of the main advantages for them. Our website contains other examples of EPDs venues. A bit about the program itself. We're a strategic non-profit joint venture between the Professional Lifecycle Assessment Societies of Australia and New Zealand, so they're 50-50 shareholders in the enterprise. We're an ISO 14025 compliant EPD program operator, and we're regional program partners of the International EPD system, who are based in Sweden. They were the first EPD system set up in the world, to my knowledge. And the International EPD system is partnering with different regions, Turkey, Australasia, Latin America, Brazil, India, to introduce and underpin credible EPD programs in regions around the world. The International EPD program has been operating for a good over 10 years now. It now has 1,000 EPDs in 37 countries. Our structure is we've got a board of directors, a technical advisory group comprised of LCA expertise, and 9 independent approved verifiers of EPDs. Our program is operated by a secretariat, Kelly Slater, who's based in New Zealand. Our current Australian Australasian EPD members, we've got listed here. We've got 20 members at the moment. We've been going for about a little over 3 years now. You can see some small, medium, and very large organisations there. Some very credible programs, companies I should say, have decided to work with the Australasian EPD program. We've got 43 EPDs registered in the Australasian EPD program, as you'll see there, and Rob will expand on that. Most of those are building products. We've got a couple registered of consumer products that are compliant with ISO 14025, but the vast majority of our 43 EPDs are building products compliant with 15804. So it's been good steady progress over the last 3 years. The products, so each company can register, develop EPDs for multiple products. I think the timber industry with Wood Solutions has 6 EPDs for various timber products. A couple of the steel companies have multiple EPDs for a range of products, as do the PVC piping manufacturers. It's not just us who really support the Australasian EPD program professionally. There's some quotes here from our members or people who've been closely involved in developing EPDs for their industries. Mark Heathcote there considers EPDs give stakeholders a lot of confidence that are telling the truth about their impact of their manufacturing process. So it gives some good, that independent verification process gives good credibility to manufacturers' claims. And Jane Mansfield with Asalio Care, you can read her quote there. She's very supportive of they're very supportive of the EPDs and the EPD process. A user of EPDs, Fraser Properties, Paolo, is a good user of EPDs, as are companies such as Lend Lease in their building and development work. EPDs are growing across the world. We have, as I mentioned, international EPD in various regions is now registered about 1,000 EPDs, but there are other EPD programs around the world. IBU in Germany have registered almost 1,500 EPDs, and most of these are for construction. So construction products. So it's really becoming the norm in this sector, driven by organisations such as infrastructure and green building councils, as well as regulations in Europe are driving the uptake of EPDs because of their credibility and scientific basis. But they're not just for construction products. I would really like to point out we've got trains and trams being registered with EPDs, electricity supplies, and both of those sectors will be having EPDs in the Australasian EPD program shortly. We've got textiles and leather. Food and agriculture is probably the second largest group after construction product EPDs that have EPDs, particularly in Europe. You can see beer, but there's also bioenergy. There's also various wheat and grain products that have EPDs, as well as services and paper products. So why EPDs in Australasia? Well, they give recognition to some of these companies, in the Green Star and Infrastructure Council of Australia, Sustainable Infrastructure Council of Australia's rating systems. They're a big part of the Green Star Future Focus. For those of you who know about the Building Green Star program here in Australia, they're actually a requirement of they're becoming a requirement of some tender documents in, particularly in New Zealand, in the train carriage tenders. Top tier companies are seeing that they underpin their commitment to environmental responsibility and transparency, and also a risk management perspective. That comprehensive nature of the environmental impacts really helps a company understand their impacts in different sectors and different impacts across their life cycle, and it helps them manage those as well as manage the claims excuse me, that go with that. And also our program has that professional credibility through its association with the professional association's ownership and participation. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Rob now.
Thank you, Steve. Just back in order for you. Yes, you've heard from both Steve and Dan, the words credibility came up a few times, rigor, quality, all these kind of terms come up, and that's what Energetics noticed. We've been involved with both the ALCAS program and the EPD program since its very early stages. And having been an LCA consultant for quite a few years, it's quite obvious that there are significant synergies and overlaps between the two programs. And so Energetics was quite well placed to actually see the benefits of aligning the two programs. So we noticed the similarities, and that clients in effect had to go through duplicate processes in order to get both an EPD and become carbon neutral certified. Both of those processes obviously take time, effort and money. And so there's very few clients who are willing to duplicate their efforts and to undergo both. And so we think there's a significant opportunity here for clients that do already have an EPD developed, or that are thinking about developing their EPD and have not yet been carbon neutral certified. So having that understanding of both, that allowed us to outline the key challenges and opportunities at a very early stage, and that allowed us to then talk to the department and the EPD program and say, well, this needs to happen in order for it to be aligned. Is that something that we can have a look into, and can we develop some guidance on that? Which is what we've done, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I first want to ask Dan and Steve, first Dan, why the department decided to pursue the Streamlined certification approach with the Australasian EPD program?
From the department's perspective, we saw the Streamlined certification approach firstly, as a way to enable the purpose of the ALCAS, and that is to provide a robust standard to enable voluntary action on climate change. The work forms part of a broader undertaking by the department to make the ALCAS more accessible. And as we'll hear, the streamlined approach makes sense, as it allows organizations to reduce their costs to achieve certification and minimizes duplication during the process, which is only a good thing for everyone involved.
Thanks, Dan. Steve, can you add what the Australasian EPD system thought?
Yeah, we were happy with the collaboration because of the similar reasons. It's obvious that there's very similar, or if not identical, processes largely. So it makes sense for our members, for our organisation, to deliver this collaboration to get better value for our members and their, so that they get the leverage and maximum use out of their Australasian EPDs. And there's obvious promotional cross benefits here that help both organisations and achieves better objectives and better environmental outcomes within Australia.
Thanks, Steve. So hopefully you now have a reasonable idea of what the overall benefits are at a very high level. So let me take you through some of the details of how it actually works in practice. And to do that, let's have a look at both the ALCAS and the EPD program certification processes. Starting with the ALCAS process, you typically start with selecting a standard that's applicable. As Dan mentioned, there are currently 5 different standards. And for us, the products and services standard is the one that's relevant. It's only for products and services that we currently are able to accommodate the streamlined process. So that standard determines the methodology and the guidelines of how to calculate your carbon footprint, or carbon account as it's called in the standard. Once you've calculated your carbon account, you prepare a public report. Those documents get independently audited. And once all of that is done, you can enter a license agreement with the department and you're able to call your product or service carbon neutral certified. Okay, that's your initial certification. Great. Then there is also a procedure for keeping that going into the future, because obviously you're generating emissions year on year, and therefore you need to measure these emissions year on year, and you need to purchase and cancel offsets year on year. Now, the process steps that are captured by the blocks in this diagram, these are the ones that are similar to the steps that you would find when developing an EPD. So you still need to measure emissions and to obtain independent audits. But for the EPD certification process, there are some minor differences. The first one is that you need to find an appropriate PCR document, which stands for Product Category Rules. And the Product Category Rules, they basically outline the methodology for that particular product category. And it's based on a broader standard for environmental product declarations, which is also aligned with Lifecycle assessment standards, the ISO 14040 series. Once you've got an appropriate PCR guidance document, you can then undertake the LCA, the Lifecycle assessment, in line with the PCR. So you undertake your LCA study. On the back of the LCA study, you compile your EPD, your environmental product declaration, which is more or less a summary of the LCA. Those documents are independently verified. And once that's done, you register and publish the EPD through the Australasian EPD program in this particular example. Excuse me. And there is also an update frequency and procedure in place that the LCA and the EPD need to be updated, in this case, after 5 years. But there are some more detailed rules around what you need to do annually in order to make sure that the information is still valid. So when we compare the two, then we see that both of them start with selecting the appropriate standard or methodology. Then you calculate your environmental footprint or carbon footprint for ALCAS. You undertake the independent audit or verification and you publish the results, and then you update that periodically, so you repeat it from step 1. Now, that automatically shows us that there is a significant overlap there, so it's more a matter of actually looking at what are the differences when we talk about methodology, when we talk about the underlying standards. And for EPDs, for environmental product declarations, I want to outline that there are currently 2 different standards that are relevant for us. The first one is ISO 14025, which is a standard that's fairly generic and covers all type of products, and outlines what an EPD should do and should contain and how you develop that at a high level. For construction products, there is a more specific standard, which is a European standard at this stage, EN 15804. And so that's not an international ISO standard, but a European standard. It is based on the international standard ISO 14025, so it doesn't contradict the international standard, but it's much more specific. And so therefore, that actually helps us in that it provides us more specific guidance on how to calculate the carbon footprint and how to measure particular results. Now, this distinction is very important because it does influence the degree to which each standard aligns with the ALCAS method. So you can imagine that if you've got a very high-level generic standard, that it's really difficult to align that with something that's more specific, such as the ALCAS method, whereas the more specific EN 15804 standard actually allows us to investigate that much more closely and to determine yes or no, does it align in specific circumstances. And similarly with the verification process, if you have a much more detailed standard such as EN 15804, then you can also standardize the verification process. And that means that, for example, under the Australasian EPD program, we have got a template, a verification template that allows the verification to be quite detailed and structured, and also gives us an audit trail where you can see exactly what the verifier has done, which criteria they have tested against, and what their findings are. And that also allows us to look at the ALCAS verification audit process and to see whether there are any major differences or not. And I'll come to that in a second. Now, Steve already outlined the types of EPDs that have been published in Australasia. If we just look at Australia, given that the ALCAS program is predominantly Australian focused, there's currently only one EPD that just aligns with ISO 14025, and there are 38 EPDs that align with both standards, the ISO 14025 and the EN 15804 standard, which means that those 38 EPDs are all related to construction products. Now, to be clear, currently the streamlined carbon accounting process, the streamlined pathway to ALCAS is available for any EPD that is compliant with EN 15804. For EPDs that are only compliant with ISO 14025, the streamlined process is possible, but you do have to actually provide a bit more information. So it's currently not something that's directly recognized because there are still a few more steps to go through. And that is something that we can't preempt and that the department can't preempt, and therefore we currently don't accommodate that specifically. Similarly, for the auditing and verification process, if you use the EN 15804 provided template, then that aligns with the ALCAS audit, and so that process can be streamlined. For ISO 14025 compliant EPDs, that's not possible yet. The EPD program is considering developing a similar template for these, but they would like to do that in association with the international EPD system, and they're currently not in that position yet. So we'll have to wait and see whether that's going to happen in the near future or not. So let's get a bit more technical. So what do you need to check when you develop your carbon footprint under the EN 15804 compliant EPD, and if you want to submit that to your ALCAS carbon account? Well, the first thing to check is to make sure that you've used the correct global warming potentials. And as a number of you might know, we used intergovernmental IPCC, before I get knotted up in acronyms, the ICCC assessment report for 2007 factors. And they are also the factors that are used in the EN 15804 compliant EPDs. For ISO 14025 EPDs, they are not specifically recommending a particular set of global warming potentials, so there could be a mismatch there, and therefore it's something that you need to check. Furthermore, there are specific requirements around how renewable energy is dealt with, and that's an area that we're seeing is getting more and more complicated, especially with PPAs coming online, the public power purchasing agreements, where companies directly purchase renewable energy from, say, a solar farm or a wind farm. Those are specific rules that need to be checked to make sure they align with the requirements. If you use any ALCAS certified products in your supply chain, under the ALCAS rules, they can be counted as zero greenhouse gas impact. Under EPD rules, those products need to be mentioned separately, and you can only account for them if you separate them out. ALCAS requires you to use specific emission factors for your Scope 1 and 2 emission sources, your direct greenhouse gas emissions, and for particular Scope 3 emission sources, indirect emission sources for waste and wastewater and fuels and electricity. Now, there are some specific rules and guidance on which emissions factors from, say, AusLCI and other databases, such as the Gabi database, how they fit in with this. And I refer to a document that we've set up to outline that in more detail. And for the base year, ALCAS requires you to set a base year for the carbon account, and that's where you choose your first 12-month period for which data has been collected. Now, if you do find that all these, what usually tend to be minor differences, but if you do find that there are aspects in the life cycle that lead to a difference in the carbon footprint between the EPD and the ALCAS methods, then what you should do is you should calculate both, and you should report both on the EPD. Because if you do that, it means that both will be verified independently before they're published, and that means that you can communicate them as relevant. Generally, those differences shouldn't be overly significant, but there could be examples where that might be the case, and that way what you do is you provide more transparency about why they're different and what has led to those differences. And we suggested that's being added to the additional environmental information on the EPD. The next slide shows you what the differences are, or what the items are that you need to check during the audit and the verification. And the first thing that's important to note is that ALCAS has requirements around who can do the audit for the carbon account, and currently only Australasian EPD program approved verifiers that are also ALCAS certified practitioners meet these requirements. So that's important to note, that you need to check whether your verifier is an ALCAS certified practitioner. If they're not, they can take the exam and they can become certified practitioners. But that gives us enough confidence that the verifiers are actually experienced in the field of EPDs and LCA. The audit documentation is also quite important. And as I mentioned before, there is a verification report and a dialogue template that records the information for EN 15804 compliant EPDs. You do need to use these templates, and you need to submit them both in their initial comments and the final version, so that there is an audit trail for the department. So if there's at any stage questions about the audit, third parties should be able to, or in this case the department should be able to look into the details and come to conclusion about whether the correct principles have been followed. Regards to the recalculation policy, ALCAS requires participants to recalculate and disclose any significant changes, any changes more than 5%, where they are not attributed to emissions reductions or changes in the volume of products produced or sold. From an EPD point of view, what the EPD shows you is a intensity. For example, kilograms of CO2 produced per ton of product, and therefore that does not change depending upon how much of the product you sell. However, you do need to check that annually also within the EPD program to make sure that there are no major changes. So what you need to do here is you need to make sure that you've got procedures in place to check that annually, and if there are significant changes, then you need to disclose those. So what next? What to do if you want to make use of the streamlined process? First, I suggest that you read the brochure that's available on the department's website, and the link is provided here. And we will be sending out the slides as well, by the way, so you don't necessarily have to write that down now. Secondly, I suggest that you contact either your LCA consultant or the department or the Australasian EPD program and ask them for more information depending on what sort of question you have. And we've provided the contact details here on the next slides. I won't go through them, obviously, but those will be sent out as well to everyone who's registered for the webinar. That brings us to the questions. I see we've got a few questions already. Please keep adding them to the screen, and I'll start going through them now. A bit bigger so I can actually see what's going on. Oh. Bear with me for a sec. Okay, so the top one, copy of the presentation. Yes, that will be sent out. The next question, European PEP Eco passports are ISO compliant but not EN compliant. Can they be recognized in our current rating systems like Green Star? Jeremy, I'm not sure if that's relevant specifically for this presentation. If you're referring to whether PEP Eco passports are able to go through the streamlined process towards ALCAS, if they're not EN compliant, then the answer is no. Because the department has got very specific rules around their methodology and the need to maintain that rigor and that transparency. And if the eco passports align well, then that needs to be assessed on its own merits. And currently that process has been done for the Australasian EPDs and EN 15804 compliant EPDs specifically. So only they are currently able to go through the streamlined process. The next question is regarding to a bridge agreement between PEP Eco Passport and the International EPD program and the Australasian EPD program. I'm not aware that that actually exists. Steve, are you aware of an agreement?
There's International EPD has a number of co-recognition agreements with some of with EPD operators like IBU, for example, but it doesn't currently have one with that PEP Eco Passport. I understand they're still working on that, but if you go to the International EPD system website, you'll see which ones they've got a mutual recognition system with.
Yeah, and I think in a similar vein, the collaboration works really well for any EPD program that aligns with EN 5804. So again, for construction products, because that is the dominant standard internationally, not just in Europe. We're using it here in Australia and New Zealand, and it's being used elsewhere. And that standard is detailed enough to actually ensure alignment makes sense. For ISO 14025, it's a lot harder to ensure that alignment, and therefore I can imagine that that's taking longer or might be too difficult in some cases. The next question is there one database that contains all EPDs in Australia and no globally? I'm not sure if there's a global one, but for Australia and New Zealand, the Australasian EPD program lists all the EPDs that are registered here. And that will take you to the International EPD Systems website, where all the EPDs listed under the International EPD System are published as well. Now, every program operator typically lists their own EPDs. So if you're looking for German or French or any other EPDs, you might have to go to the local program operator, unfortunately. I'm not aware of a database currently existing that keeps track of that globally. But yeah, that would be great if that exists. One question for Steve. What databases are predominantly adopted to conduct the LCA for an EPD in Australia? Is it the BPIC LCI database?
Well, I'm not an EPD practitioner myself.
Take that on?
Don't mind, yeah, that would be good. I mean,
yeah,
thank you.
It was handballed to you directly there, Steve, so that's why I mentioned that. Thanks for the question, Mandy. No, the BPIC LCI database is not used for EPDs. In fact, it would not be suitable to be used for EPDs because it doesn't meet the quality criteria in general. So predominantly, you'll find that the databases that are being used are the Gabi proprietary databases for anyone who's using the Gabi software. And for anyone using other software, I would suggest that AusLCI is your first port of call. AusLCI plus its shadow database have been verified and have been shown to meet the minimum criteria that are relevant. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use any other databases, but if you do use other data, then you just need to make sure that they're appropriate. You still have to do that for AusLCI data or other data, but yeah, basically those are the main ones, Gabi and AusLCI.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, Rob. I mean, I was involved in that BPIC LCI database for the timber industry when I was with the timber industry, and the BPIC process was very good to get those industries to get base data. So you're actually finding that it was really good for those industries to go out and get their data from the manufacturing operations of steel, concrete, masonry products, timber products, and that data is being used by those industries now to develop industry average EPDs or product-specific EPDs for those manufacturers. So it's not like that BPIC database has not been used. It's just transitioned to more specific EPDs with the respective associations and companies.
Yep. I think we've reached the end of the list of questions. Are there any further questions? This is your chance. A few more minutes. Alright. Oh, I see one pop up here. When would an individual company EPD be better than an industry version? Steve, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I was personally involved in industry average EPDs for the timber industry, and they can be really good where you've got a lot of players in an industry, a lot of small, medium-sized manufacturers, which the timber industry is. So an industry average EPD can be a good way to introduce a sector to the benefits of a life cycle assessment and EPDs. And often these small and medium-sized enterprises where the benefits mightn't be tangible, or they haven't got a big product range accessible in the commercial construction sphere. So it's a good cost-effective way for an industry to get their foot in the door. And then what we're finding with that industry average EPD is that individual companies are now starting to see the benefits for their own enterprise and their own products. So they're going to take the step now for product-specific EPDs. So they're good sort of step on the way to product-specific EPDs for some industries. You can also see the PVC pipe industry, where the association was involved in helping a couple of their specific product manufacturers with EPDs. They didn't develop an industry average EPD. It turned out they developed 2 product-specific EPDs. So industry associations and industry average EPDs definitely have their place in the EPD process.
Yep, and to add to that, some of the programs that are using or recognizing EPDs, such as Green Star from the Green Building Council and the IS rating tool from the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, they provide a different weight and value to EPDs depending on whether they're company or product specific or whether they're industry generic.
Yes, that's true. I don't necessarily agree with that differentiation myself, but I don't think it's very fair, because
and that could change in the future as well. That's just the current situation.
Yeah.
Love it how these. Maybe I should, if this helps.
Who consults the LCA study?
Here we go. That makes more sense. The webinar will be made available at a later stage. We hope that the recording worked well, Pratik. So in that case, we will make it available. Who consults the LCA studies? Thinking you're asking about who are the LCA consultants. I would suggest to have a look at ALCAS, the Australian LCA Society, for a list of members that are active in this field. There are others as well, obviously. There's a range of consultants who do these things. And for NCOS, there are a number of specific consultants active in the carbon sector. And do you have an overview of that somewhere, Dan?
We do host a register on a third-party website called the Carbon Market Portal, which provides information for consultants and auditors who are eligible to work on NCOS certifications.
Can a verified EPD process rather than a single published EPD be used to issue systematic NCOS certifications? We're not sure about that, Joanna. We haven't gone through that process because there is no verified EPD, process EPD currently up and running. So that's something that's, I believe, under development. If they align with EN 5804, then I can't see why that's not possible, but we will have to look and see if there's any issues regarding the verification that the department might see. So we would actually have to go through the process to test that. I think that takes us through the questions. Who conducts the LCAs for different industries? That's basically the same answer as I gave you before regarding who the LCA consultants and the carbon accountants are. There's no specific split of who does what and who looks after a specific industry. Given the timing, I think this concludes the webinar. Thank you everyone for your attention and for your questions. Really appreciate that. Thanks Steve and Dan for your contributions as well. Much appreciated. And as indicated, we'll make the the webinar and the presentation available. We'll send everyone an email with the details regarding that. So, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Rob.